The involvement of the Army of the United States in the international conflict known as the World War signified a great change in American civilization. This was the first time the United States had been involved in a war outside its own territorial borders. Other than the thousands of deaths suffered at the hands of the enemies, something else died during this war too: an innocence. As President Woodrow Wilson and the nation saluted the survivors of this war and mourned the dead, the nation grew out of its turbulent adolescence and into troubled adulthood. The flood of immigrants continued from Europe: Poland, Italy, Ireland, Spain, France, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, all looking forward to a new life in a new country. But the immigrants stayed together in enclaves, ghettos, where they could speak their own languages and keep their old ways. They were shunned by the descendants of the older immigrants and very often could find no work other than low-paying, low-skilled jobs. Crime and alcoholism were rampant, and prohibitionists argued for the outright banning of alcohol.
I have lived long enough to see the white-winged dove of Prohibition build her nest upon the dome of the captain at Washington and spread her bright pinions of peace and prosperity over our land from sea to sea and from the Gulf to the Great Lakes. And in the province of God, I'm going to live long enough to see America so dry you'll have to prime a man before he can spit. And I'll fight the saloon from Hawaii to Hoboken. And I'll kick it as long as I've got a foot. And I'll fight it and punch it as long as I have a fist. I'll butt it as long as I have a head. I'll bite it as long as I have a tooth. And when I'm old and fistless and footless and toothless, I'll gum it till I go home to glory and it goes home to perdition.
Simultaneous with the Prohibition movement was the women's suffrage movement. Though the movements were unrelated, many women's suffrage movement leaders were also prohibitionists. Politicians could not afford to alienate potentially millions of new American voters. Eventually, American women got the right to vote, but they found themselves politically tied to people like the hatchet-faced, hatchet-wielding prohibitionist Carrie Nation. As would occur 60 years later, a well-meaning but school-marmish Democrat was voted out in favor of a likable Republican who told the public what it wanted to hear. Warren G. Harding endorsed prohibition, but secretly drank and smoked cigars at all-night poker parties. However, he wasn't the only scofflaw in America. Many ingenious methods were soon devised to circumvent the outlawing of liquor. Public displays showed an ambiguity toward prohibition, but the law enforcement departments, particularly Treasury, took its job very seriously, destroying stills publicly for the newsreel cameras. On local levels, law enforcement officials created huge bonfires in which crates of liquor were destroyed. In Chicago, Big Bill Thompson was elected as reform candidate. As with many reform candidates in major city politics over the next 60 years, Thompson's reforms were largely superficial. As corrupt as any mayor has ever been, Thompson set the stage for Chicago to become one of the two major nerve centers for organized crime in America. The public liked him because he tried to keep taxes down. Of course, that meant less money for law enforcement, potential for law enforcement officials to become corrupt to supplement their own income. But taxpayers had a choice. They could pay higher taxes to hire more police, or they could pay lower taxes and take the chance of corruption running through the city. They made the obvious choice. From the Wrigley Building to the stockyards, from the Loop to Lakeshore Drive, Chicago was a town that was up for grabs. In New York, from the Bronx to the Battery, from uptown to downtown, Prohibition took its toll. The Great White Way seemed dimmed by the loss of champagne and whiskey. One man who promised to bring back some of the glamour was the master of the fix, Arnold Rothstein, Mr. Big, the prototype of the big city gangster. His main claim to fame was fixing the 1919 World Series, paying off ball players. Rothstein himself could make a fortune on a bet. He saw the power and money in providing illegal booze to a thirsty New York. This was the New York of Cole Porter and Irving Berlin. Stars like the Marx Brothers and Will Rogers were on Broadway. Shows like Ziegfeld's Follies and Earl Carroll's Vanities made Broadway the light of the city. The New York underworld reaped the riches from Prohibition with less violence and less publicity. And they changed with the times, too, which ensured that they'd last longer. At the beginning of Prohibition, Arnold Rothstein was a criminal with vision. He saw that the Prohibition laws were hardly enforceable. Men and women, rich and poor, were going to drink no matter what Washington, D.C. told them. But he sat out the first few months, letting others take the risks. When Detroit bootlegger Maxie Greenberg came to Rothstein for a loan, Rothstein had a better idea. Rather than dealing with high-priced Canadian smugglers, Rothstein proposed importing directly from French and British distilleries, then sneaking the booze on shore during the night using fast speedboats. This big business approach worked, and Rothstein became the most important liquor importer on the East Coast. But he bailed out after a year, returning to his first love, gambling. Despite the risks, there were plenty of guys willing to fill Rothstein's shoes. And Rothstein took several of them under his wing, teaching them the ins and outs of crime, teaching them to be presentable and how to be respected at posh Park Avenue parties and uptown clubs. These were guys from the mean streets of New York, the ghettos, the back alleys, Hell's Kitchen. Young men who watched their parents work in sweatshops 12 and 15 hours a day and grow old fast. People who saw firsthand the cheapness of life, the unfairness. Boys who grew up on the streets in the shadow of the L train, playing stickball and throwing dice in the backyard. They learned to be tough, to defend themselves and also to defend their friends. They also learned rackets early, like pimping, protection racket. Knock over a newsstand, then warn the newsie that it might happen again, unless you pay us. Men like Charlie Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, both of them first-generation immigrants from Europe. Both of them had seen the rough side of life and learned under Arnold Rothstein's tutelage. They looked to him as a mentor, until Rothstein was killed in a poker game. But in the great tradition of American business, Rothstein's empire survived him. There was a demand for booze, and there would be people who would supply it, whether it was organized crime or disorganized crime, whether by the thousands of bottles or in somebody's bathtub, with a good dose of turpentine to add the proper kick. There were Jewish gangs, Italian gangs, Sicilian gangs, and Irish gangs. They flouted the law on land, air, and on sea. But a fertile corruption in society is necessary in order for crime to flourish and grow. And it all starts with the government. America had that breeding ground. Personally likable President Warren G. Harding turned a blind eye toward corruption and graft within his own administration. His Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, was thrown into prison for graft on a scale of millions of dollars, making the biggest bootleggers look like pikers in comparison. Another component needed in order for corruption and crime to grow is a large group of people who are unhappy with their position in society. The huge influx of immigrants that were streaming into America fit this need perfectly. Many of these new arrivals found the American dream was more myth than reality, and having nothing to lose, turned to crime to make at least their version of the dream come true. In the 1920s, the contemporary attitude toward immigrants was ambivalent. The biggest star of the early 1920s was Rudolph Valentino, who began his career in a film called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. He went on to epitomize the Latin lover in films like The Sheik, The Eagle, and Son of the Sheik. Valentino established the prototype of the attractive immigrant. However, others like Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were the reverse of that immigrant coin. They were the self-professed anarchists who believed all governments, particularly democracies, were evil. Like Valentino, they spoke with heavy Italian accents, but with accused murderers, this was sinister, not charming. The shoemaker and fish peddler were accused of 2 murders in the course of a 1920 bank robbery to finance anti-government terrorism. To the end, they professed their innocence, but after 7 years of appeals, they were executed. Judge Webster Thayer, who presided over the case, had his home completely destroyed by a bomb years later. The prohibition of the sale of alcohol in the United States, which sounded like such a good idea, was seen as a dismal failure. People would drink even though it was illegal, and that meant a nation of criminals. Even some of the most vociferous proponents of prohibition realized that all this was doing was creating a criminal empire within the continental United States. But changing the law again was not so easily done. Prohibition was not just a law, it was an amendment to the Constitution, and the Constitution is not easily changed or unchanged.
The Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform comes to ask you to consider seriously the question of the repeal of the 18th Amendment. It's no longer a question of liquor or no liquor. It's a question of racketeers or no racketeers. We believe that the 18th Amendment has failed, and failed badly. The 18th Amendment has delivered this nation bound hand and foot to organized crime.
But then, as now, politicians had their own agendas. Rather than concentrate on the growing cancer of organized crime and its direct cause, prohibition, they were swept up in a wave of pro-American rhetoric. So-called subversives were rounded up and deported, immigrants whose crimes were twofold. They had foreign-sounding names, and they thought the American system should be changed to protect all people. A young bachelor named J. Edgar Hoover first rose to prominence at this time as one of the most outspoken defenders of the all-American ideal. But all-American meant all-white, male-dominated, and Protestant. No blacks, Asians, Catholics, Jews, Italians, Eastern Europeans, or women need apply. And so these vast numbers of people were held by society in their ghettos and narrow neighborhoods. A career in crime remained one of the few ways to escape this invisible prison. And the few who made it big time tried desperately to aspire to what they saw as class. Al Capone, for instance, had no more than a 4th grade education, but he grew to love opera. The dinner jackets and the gowns, the vast theaters, the orchestrations. This was class. At precisely 12 midnight on January 16, 1920, the Volstead Act served to close down every tavern, bar, and saloon in America. The next morning, Al Capone awoke to celebrate his 21st birthday. These two events, Prohibition and Al Capone's maturity as a racketeer and bootlegger extraordinaire, would ultimately define 1920s America more than any flagpole-sitting contest, marathon dance, or flapper ever could. As the decade progressed, Capone's meteoric rise to underworld prominence and his ultimate dominance of the city of Chicago would closely parallel the 13 outrageous, villainous, and fantastic years of Prohibition. Years that saw Al Capone become the godfather of crime. Petty thefts, con games, gang fights, burglary, extortion, attempted murder, these were the activities that shaped the childhood of Alphonse Capone. Born in 1899 in the rough-and-tumble Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, New York, he was the fourth child of Gabriel and Teresa Capone, who had migrated from Naples, Italy to America in 1893. But although Capone had 8 other brothers and sisters, he quickly distanced himself from the family hearth and took to the streets like a duck to water. Capone was physically suited for the life of crime. Even as a child, his stocky, unusually powerful build was a daunting force in the neighborhood, and his squat nose, thick lips, and huge hands quickly became notorious weapons of incalculable intimidation and violence. Early in his criminal career, Capone worked as a bouncer at the infamous Harvard Inn, one of the most disreputable brothels in all of Brooklyn. One night on the job, Capone made an unkind remark about a female customer standing at the bar. The woman's brother, underworld figure Frank Galucco, heard what Capone said, pulled a knife and slashed the youthful bouncer, leaving 3 nasty, indelible scars on the left side of Capone's face. Capone's resultant nickname, Scarface, became his trademark for life, although he tried valiantly to hide the hideous wounds with daily applications of talcum powder. But while Capone's appearance fit the classic mold of the streetwise hood, it was his brilliantly sinister mind that distinguished him as a force to be reckoned with within the netherworld of the criminal underground. While still a teenager in Brooklyn, Capone joined up with the powerful Kelly's 5 Points gang run by Paolo Vaccarelli, alias Paul Kelly. Capone spearheaded the gang's assault on union labor leaders, successfully slamming them for dues kickbacks. Another member of Kelly's 5 Points gang was Johnny the Fox Torrio, who quickly became the young Capone's criminal mentor, despite their wildly contrasting personalities. Scarface was a flamboyant and outrageous child of the media, telling reporters at one point that his facial scars had occurred while fighting with the famous Lost Battalion in France. But Johnny Torrio was quiet, subdued, and shunned publicity. And while Capone was arrested and prosecuted on a regular basis throughout his youth, Torrio successfully avoided the authorities and was the only criminal kingpin to emerge from the vicious street gangs of New York without earning a police record. Johnny Torrio had made his reputation back east, but was called to Chicago by his uncle. His uncle owned 35 whorehouses and 2 high-class brothels and was being blackmailed by some black-handers and needed some muscle. Torrio's uncle was Big Jim Colosimo. This soft-spoken, opera-loving pimp founded a crime empire on the trade of female flesh. However, Colosimo was at odds with Torrio. He wanted to stay away from illegal booze, while Torrio knew there was too much money in bootlegging to stay away much longer. Torrio immediately sent for his protege, Capone, who emigrated to the city he would soon come to rule. But for now, Big Jim was still in charge. Soon, things would change, with a bang. Booze had been a part of the American experience since before the Revolution. Indeed, one of the most famous battles of the Revolutionary War was the battle at Brandywine. The outlawing of alcoholic beverages did nothing to stem the natural human urge for altered states of consciousness. Booze became ridiculously expensive. After Prohibition, the cost of a 15-cent shot of whiskey shot up to 75 cents. This meant extraordinary profits for those who would be willing to take the risk of federal and local police taking everything away. This was a risk that Big Jim Colosimo did not want to take. He had a nice wife and a nice girlfriend. He was doing very well with his whorehouses throughout Chicago, and he even opened a legitimate enterprise, Colosimo's Cafe at 2126 South Wabash Avenue. Here, amidst old-world splendor and gold and crystal chandeliers, one could meet celebrities like gangster Dion O'Banion, writer Ring Lardner, or the opera singer Enrico Caruso. Colosimo saw no percentage in getting into another racket entirely. He knew nothing about the import or export of alcohol. He knew only that you could buy it when you needed it, and you could get plenty of it. All of his brothels and his restaurants served alcohol, but he let other chumps run the risk of supplying it. But Johnny Torrio was ambitious, and he saw the situation another way. Alcohol was very inexpensive to produce, and as it was illegal, extremely profitable to sell. If you could corner the market, not only in retail but in wholesale, you could make a fortune. Torrio wasn't the only one who realized this. Chicago was only a microcosm of the nation. From the largest cities to the backwoods stills, alcohol became big business. A business big enough that human life meant very little. Often booze came across the Great Lakes from Canada, where it was still legal. Just as often, the only thing legitimate about the booze was the label. Police tried desperately to keep bootleggers in line, but there was too much money to be made. Courts became revolving doors. People went in, and they came out. There was more than enough money to grease the wheels of justice. All the fines and short-term jail sentences and public displays of bottle breaking couldn't convince America that it wasn't supposed to drink. Capone arrived in Chicago carrying the family Bible. He started work in Colosimo's criminal empire at a salary of $75 a week, toiling first as a bouncer, then as a bagman, and finally as a gun-toting bodyguard. Capone's street smarts, animal instincts, and criminal cunning were in full flower, but his aesthetic sensibilities were miserably lacking. It was Colosimo who first introduced Capone to the narcissistic, high-living, socially flamboyant lifestyle of a gangster king, teaching him a rudimentary appreciation of opera on top of it all. But Capone was a leader, not a follower. He intuitively knew that to call the shots himself, he'd have to establish his own identity and independence. Immediately upon his arrival in Chicago, Capone set up his own legit business as a second-hand furniture dealer and set about installing broken-down sofas and love seats in all the brothels managed by Big Jim Colosimo. And when Prohibition became law in 1920, Capone, like Torrio, instantly saw the opportunity to move. He and Torrio teamed up to find a way to capitalize on the lucrative potential that illegal alcohol trafficking could bring. But when they presented their case to Big Jim Colosimo, he wanted nothing to do with it. The prostitution business was operating smoothly as silk, and Colosimo saw no reason to become involved in such an untested and potentially problem-plagued market such as bootlegging. But soon, Torrio and Capone would no longer have to worry about Big Jim. On May 11, 1920, with Prohibition nearly 4 months old, Big Jim Colosimo arrived at his nightclub to sign for a shipment of alcohol. When he entered the club, the powerful and violent mobster Frankie Yale, who Capone used to work for in New York, was hiding in a glass-walled telephone booth. He fired 2 quick shots that killed Big Jim instantly. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, Yale ripped at Colosimo's ornate silken suit as he lay dying to make his killing appear to be the handiwork of a common robber. This perverse but pragmatic touch instantly made an impression on Capone and would come to typify his own flamboyantly original manner of retribution in the years to come. The day after Colosimo's murder, Capone, Torrio, and Yale were arrested and questioned by police, but no witnesses came forward and they were immediately exonerated. Frankie Yale had murdered Colosimo in an effort to take over the gangster's $1 million prostitution business in Chicago. But after Big Jim's $20,000 funeral, the first of many elaborate memorial services for upper echelon gangsters, Torrio and Capone were able to smoothly take the reins of Colosimo's criminal empire on Chicago's South Side. Torrio became the brains of the outfit. Protege Scarface provided the muscle. And lubricated by bootleg hooch, they ambitiously set their sights on ruling the entire city of Chicago. "Everybody calls me a racketeer," said Capone at the time. "I call myself a businessman. When I sell liquor, it's bootlegging. When my patrons serve it on Lakeshore Drive, it's hospitality." But despite the sophistication and elegance of the Prohibition era, the staggering profitability of bootleg whiskey, coupled with the financial windfall of the speakeasy trade, created a turbulent atmosphere of violence, wanton destruction, and utter lawlessness throughout the Windy City. With tens of millions of dollars at stake, Chicago was a turbulent town. But Johnny Torrio's primary problem was a reformed mayor, William E. Deaver. Torrio had offered him a large-sized bribe, but Deaver responded by closing down Torrio's club, the Four Deuces. Deaver then raided breweries, speakeasies, gambling parlors, and brothels all over Chicago. A lot of gangsters found themselves in jail wondering what went wrong. This battle of wills finally forced Johnny Torrio to relocate south to suburban Cicero. The Chicago underworld was once again in a state of enforced peace. Eventually, the Torrio-Capone mob set their sights on the more lucrative north side of town and the massive brewery and distillery operations of legendary mobster Dion O'Banion. The threat of full-scale gang warfare on the streets of Chicago loomed menacingly. O'Banion was an Irishman through and through who hated the Italians Torrio and Capone with a blistering passion. Though his image was far from benevolent, O'Banion was publicly known as a regular churchgoer. His motto was, "My money goes to those who need it," and true to his word, he had food, clothing, and furniture delivered every week to the decrepit tenement districts in his North Side territory. But while O'Banion's outer appearance was charitably gratifying, he secretly wore 3 guns at all times in specially sewn pockets in his pants in order to further his deep-set criminal ambitions. In 1924, O'Banion hatched a wicked scheme to take the Italians for all they were worth. He called Johnny Torrio, offered to sell him a North Side brewery for $500,000, and waited for the South Side mobster to take the bait. Torrio did. Just days later, the transaction was concluded. Police, purportedly on O'Banion's payroll, burst into the brewery, took Torrio into custody, and closed down the massive distillery. When Capone learned what had happened, he instantly took action. On November 8, 1924, 3 of his hired guns walked into O'Banion's flower shop and fired point-blank at the gangster kingpin. O'Banion fell, mortally wounded, into a bucket of flowers. At O'Banion's funeral, which featured thousands of dollars worth of bouquets from the very shop in which the mobster was murdered, Jaime Weiss, a close ally of O'Banion's, reportedly cried and vowed on the spot to kill Johnny Torrio and Al Capone. 2 months later, after unsuccessful attempts on both Torrio and Capone, Weiss succeeded in driving the mild-mannered Torrio out of town. The Fox settled for a more easygoing life back in Italy. The move left Al Capone, at the age of 25, with everything. He was suddenly the undisputed king of Chicago's South Side and held a specially reserved box at the Opera. Setting up operations at the lavish Lexington Hotel, Scarface hung a picture of George Washington, his hero, on the wall, and purchased a luxurious retreat in Palm Island, Florida. But Capone's attention was ever focused on the lucrative North Side operations of O'Banion's successor, Jaime Weiss, and Scarface mapped out an ambitious plan of attack. But Weiss struck first. On September 20th, 1926, as Capone was having coffee in the restaurant of the Hawthorne Hotel, Weiss materialized with his chief hitman, Bugs Moran, known as the Shootin' Fool, and 8 carloads of fellow machine gun-toting torpedoes. Raking the hotel with bullets, Jaime's men succeeded in destroying every window in the place. Miraculously, no one was killed. Capone emerged from the shooting unscathed and called for a public truce with Weiss. But privately, Scarface had other ideas about Jaime Weiss and his gang. "Those bastards are dead," he yelled to his minions. "They're all dead, do you hear me? Dead, dead, dead." Capone examined his squadron of 400 employees, selected his 4 top guns, Frank Diamond, Frank Nitti, John Scalisi, and Albert Anselmi, and set them off on a clandestine journey to the North Side. Once there, they quietly rented an apartment that looked directly into Jaime Weiss' headquarters, mounted machine guns, and waited for the Mob King to show himself. He finally did on October 11th, 1926. Weiss and 3 of his bodyguards emerged from a touring car on the avenue below. Capone's 4 hitmen couldn't wait. They pointed their weapons down at the street and opened fire, and added Jaime Weiss to the lengthening list of hapless Capone victims. Explaining the hit later, Capone said, "40 times I've tried to arrange things so we could have peace and life would be worth living, but Jaime Weiss couldn't be told anything." With Weiss out of the way, Capone controlled every major vice racket in the city of Chicago, and quickly cutting politicians and policemen in on the outrageous bootlegging profits, Scarface set about becoming a legitimate power broker in the city as well. A previous mayor of Chicago, Joseph Klena, had once been pushed down the stairs of Town Hall by Capone, who was never arrested for the assault. But Capone didn't want to just steamroll politicians. He wanted to own them. With this in mind, Scarface ingratiated himself with the Republican politico Big Bill Thompson and set the Capone machine in motion, patrolling Chicago's poll booths to ensure Big Bill's election to the mayor's seat. The year was 1927. Charles Lindbergh had just completed his historic flight across the Atlantic, and Al Capone was at the pinnacle of his criminal career. With his syndicate firmly in place, with bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling doing bigger business than ever, and with Big Bill sitting in the mayor's office, Capone's profits soared to a cool $105 million a year. But as the 1920s drew to a close, Capone sought to expand his operations even further. He would eventually own an estimated 10,000 speakeasies in Chicago alone, and would completely control the bootlegging industry from Florida to Canada. With such outrageous profits came outrageous attempts on Capone's life. Scarface took refuge in an elaborate armored office that took up a whole floor of the Hawthorne Hotel. He rode about town in a massive bulletproof McFarland limousine, specially built at a cost of $12,500. It was preceded by an armed car 1 block ahead, and followed by another 1 block behind. In the late 1920s, Bugs Moran, the Shootin' Fool, was the only real threat to Capone's empire. Scarface decided to do something about it. On February 14th, 1929, St. Valentine's Day, a small group of men wearing police uniforms arrived at Bugs Moran's bootleg headquarters and lined up 7 of the upper echelon Irish mobsters who were present. Bugs himself, arriving late, saw the policemen enter the distillery and decided to hide out until the officers made their arrests and left. But the men inside were actually Capone's henchmen, and they weren't interested in arrests. Instead, they lined the 7 thugs against the wall. But one of Moran's men smelled a rat. Seeing the plainclothes policeman with machine guns, one of Bug's men said, "Hey, you guys ain't cops." But it was too late. It was murder as brutal and cold-blooded as any in U.S. history. The men oozed life onto the bare cement floor of the garage, brains, blood, flesh, and cloth clotted together. Adam Heyer, Frank Foster, John May, Al Weinshank, Frank Clark, Frank Gusenberg, and Pete Gusenberg. The only survivor of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a German shepherd dog tethered in the corner. Its whimpers and cries finally alerted neighbors and the police to the horror in the garage at 2122 North Clark Street. But that was Chicago. In New York, Salvatore Luciano tried to play things a little more subtly. Salvatore Luciano had anglicized his first name to Charles. His nickname, Lucky, stemmed from the fact that he was one of the few gangsters who ever went on a one-way ride and returned. Luciano received his basic training with Kelly's 5 Points gang in New York's Lower East Side and apprenticed with Johnny Torrio until Torrio went to Chicago. Charlie Lucky's specialty was women and pushing drugs. He ultimately became the biggest pimp in New York when he joined the Masseria crime family. He sold protection to the madams and their girls. Those who didn't buy protection sometimes didn't walk very well afterward. Sometimes they weren't so pretty either. Girls who came to New York looking for glamour ended up hooking for Luciano. Luciano collected 50% from every madam and prostitute in New York. By 1927, he was a millionaire, a world-class pimp, and in control of all prostitution in Manhattan. Yes, it was the roaring 20s, and everybody was having such a good time. Just don't ask them what their dreams were before they met Lucky Luciano. Intertwined with the life and career of Lucky Luciano in New York was the younger Benjamin Siegel, nicknamed Bugsy, because he was so violent his friends thought he had bugs in his head. Siegel had first run into Luciano in a fight over a whore. The 2 teenage gangsters started wailing on each other until a third man, 15-year-old Meyer Lansky, intervened. The 3 remained friends, if not inseparable, for life. Benjamin Siegel had a hot temper and he disliked farming out duties to people he didn't trust. As a result, he became a hitman who did most of the hits himself. This retentive nature would serve him well in certain crime enterprises at the early stages of his career, but would eventually prove his undoing. There were few ways to get out of the slums, but people like Lucky Luciano, Francesco Saviera, alias Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, an anemic Jew with a head for figures, and Bugsy Siegel used their individual attributes to claw their way uptown. In these days, before organized crime was primarily taken over by the Italian mobs, the Bugs Meyer gang was well known for Bugs providing the brawn and Meyer providing the brain. Along with bootleg booze and other of Bugs' specialties was the protection racket, setting fires to places and then collecting insurance against future fires. The extortion and protection rackets were kept in place by the well-cooked bomb. No business was too small or too large. Most businesses paid their tribute simply to stay out of trouble. Those who refused paid a much higher price, complete loss of their livelihood. This kind of fear was the prime ingredient for the success of the protection racket. It was sort of like private insurance in reverse. Pay us or we'll make sure something terrible happens to you. It was a scam that went back to the days of the Black Hand. Most businessmen caved into the protection racket. Those who didn't, if they were lucky, had their places bombed when nobody was there. A black powder bomb was easy to make, and it could even be carried in a lunch pail. You either paid for protection or you got bombed. Not even defense factories during World War II were immune. Mafiosi were as patriotic as anybody, but business was business. Siegel admired Lansky's brains and treated him almost like an older brother. Lansky respected Siegel in turn and was fond of him. Even Luciano liked having Bugs around. He was a good guy, said Luciano years later, but such brotherly warmth was conditional. When it came down to business, everyone, regardless of ethnic background, became ice cold. Siegel was one of the coldest of the bunch. With a .45 in his hand, his baby blue eyes could turn to steel in a moment. According to legend, once he was playing poker with a friend who thought he was cheating. He plugged him, then sat the corpse up and plugged him again. Bugsy liked the company of women. The gaudier, the flashier, the better. But he wasn't above rape. He was arrested by New York police in 1926 for attacking and beating a woman. The file on his arrest was conveniently lost, but the mugshots remained. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence when the witness, terrified out of her mind, refused to testify. Bugsy and 8 of his friends were rousted at the Hotel Franconia in November of 1931. This was basically an example of Bugsy Siegel spreading his social wings, and the New York police clipping them. Lansky and Costello and Luciano were not the only gangsters to enjoy nightlife in the roaring 20s in New York. Jack Legs Diamond was continuously in the newspapers. He had been Arnold Rothstein's chief enforcer, and he enjoyed his work. There were a lot of people who seriously thought Legs Diamond couldn't be killed. He'd been shot on at least 3 occasions and had been riddled with bullets, but had lived to tell the tale. Diamond was primarily a racketeer who got his start in the garment industry. He later moved into dope. Legs Diamond was as at home in Manhattan as he was in New York's Catskill Mountains, where he had a highly guarded retreat. As with most of his fellow gangsters, Legs had an impressive list of offenses, but nearly every charge was dismissed for lack of evidence. Witnesses didn't like to say anything bad against him. Even when a punk kid like Louis Cohen was charged with a shooting on behalf of Legs, he had murdered Kid Dropper, Nathan Kaplan, and another gangster, the young Louis Cohen kept quiet. In the end, Legs Diamond proved as mortal as everyone else. In 1931, in his retreat in Albany, New York, unknown gangsters found him while he was asleep and blasted him full of holes. Charlie Entrata, the head of Legs Diamond's goon squad, took revenge in the usual gangland fashion, but his vendetta came a little too late for Jack Diamond, who headed to the cemetery legs first. In Chicago, the dismal end of the 20s big-time gangster boss Bugs Moran was particularly pathetic. Moran had inherited Deanna Banion's gang on Chicago's north side and was the major character in the bootleg war between the Irish and the Italian families in Chicago. But the St. Valentine's Day massacre wiped out Moran's power. However, he was able to exact some small revenge on one of the St. Valentine's Day murderers, Machine Gun Jack McGurn, who was hit in 1936, on the eve of St. Valentine's Day. Moran himself was never a force in the underworld after that. He turned to petty crimes, kidnapping and small-time robberies. He died in prison in 1957. Whether in a barbershop chair, driving in a car, or sitting at home, many gangsters ended up dead because they crossed the wrong guy. Generally, it was straightforward. Murdered because of a vendetta, or to keep somebody silent who might squeal, or to take over new territory. Anyone who thinks that the 1980s and 90s are blood-filled should take a look at newspaper photographs from the time. No place was safe, not a man's home nor his office. Revenge was swift, sure, and bloody. But sometimes it took bizarre and ironic twists. 12 slugs from a high-powered rifle spelled the end of Louis L. Terry, a lunatic who had once executed a horse. Rooftop snipers were one of the most effective ways of knocking out an enemy. Gambling boss Danny Stanton got his in a more personal way. Thugs walked up to him in a saloon and emptied their guns into him. Powerful beer baron Joe Santos was also pushed out of the limelight. Santos sat impoverished in a police station after being beaten in a drunken brawl. Somebody had splintered a guitar over the old gangster's cranium. Battered and torn, he himself was charged with disorderly conduct. After that, Santos was never the same. The murder of beautiful blonde Estelle Carey, girlfriend of the mob, shook the underworld. It was one of the most cold-blooded and bizarre of gang murders. The beautiful Dice Queen was found blackjacked to death in her fire-swept apartment. The story goes that this beautiful model in Gangster's Mall knew too much about the gang's extortion racket. One of the most fascinating and unsung gangsters was Roger Toohey, called Terrible Toohey, although the only thing terrible about him was his terribly ironic fate. He was a smart enough guy who made some money dabbling in oil leases in the 1920s and started a trucking company. But he branched out and sold bootleg liquor extremely well because he made good beer and paid off local cops and politicians and brewed beer especially for them. But Toohey was doing too well. Al Capone got wind of his success and decided that Des Plaines, Illinois was too close to Chicago for the competition. Capone sent a number of goons down to Toohey's area, but they reported back that Toohey's gang was incredible. Dozens of guys, heavily armed. Capone's men even reported back that Toohey had threatened Capone's life on a phone call they overheard. But the fact was, there was no Toohey gang. His gang members were simply guys from the neighborhood he'd rounded up and armed with shotguns and pistols he'd borrowed from the police. Toohey was captured in Wisconsin and charged with kidnapping of a St. Paul brewer. He was acquitted, but charged again in the kidnapping of a Chicago stock speculator. The abducted man swore that Toohey was the kidnapper, and Toohey swore that he had been framed by Al Capone. Under heavy guard during the trial, Toohey and what passed for his gang were given heavy sentences. Toohey's smiling demeanor became grim as he realized he was going to prison for 99 years for a kidnap he had nothing to do with. He admitted bootlegging, but flatly denied ever kidnapping anyone. But the full force of the Chicago legal system and the vengeful Capone mob was thrown against him. Toohey waited nervously for the jury to return. The headlines screamed the verdict. Terrible Roger Toohey sentenced to 99 years. But after only 8 years in jail, he and several fellow convicts shot their way out of prison. In a well-laid trap set by FBI agents in Chicago, 2 of the fugitives were shot and killed while resisting capture. So died Jimmy O'Connor and St. Clair McInerney. The leader, Toohey, was captured without a shot being fired, yet his wily, clever mind never stopped working even while he was being taken back in chains to prison. The racketeer still insisted he was innocent of kidnapping. A frame-up, he called the kidnap charge. He secured additional hearings in federal court protesting that he had been framed. Through the 40s and into the 50s, Toohey, though still in prison, fought for hearing after hearing. Paper after paper was filed on his behalf. He told his story many times to newspapermen. A stern, justice-loving federal court judge studied carefully the thousands of legal documents filed on behalf of Toohey. The judge, who loved the quiet of his farm, handed down the ruling that circled the world in headlines. Toohey was freed. The judge agreed that the former beer baron had been unjustly sentenced. In 1959, Toohey was embraced by his wife as he stepped into the free world. He walked out into the beautiful snow and told reporters that he had no grudges. He said, "But I am resentful. Who wouldn't be after 25 years in prison for something I never did?" He was free now and back with his friends. Most of his old cronies were gone. Most had died violently. But the former gang ruler looked ahead to a new life. About a month later, he was murdered as he walked up the steps to his new home. Shot down by unknown assailants. He was mortally wounded and would die in a few hours in the hospital. Police took the dying man away. The question was, why was Toohey murdered, ambushed and slain less than a month after he had won his freedom? When he walked out of prison, he said he bore no grudges, but there must have been others who still did have a grudge against him. Did the now aging Toohey still know too much? Did the mob still fear terrible Toohey? Had he talked too much? Was Toohey murdered for revenge or the fear that he still might talk? Before he died, he still had nothing to say except that he didn't know the two men who had cut him down with shotguns. As another famous beer baron had once said, there are a lot of big guys, there are a lot of little guys, and then the whole thing goes bang. Roger Toohey learned the hard way. Some gangsters never forget.